Hello, we're back with
Hello.
episode 21. I hope everybody's having a good weekend so far. We got a lot of stuff done in the last 2 days, so
We
I
did.
feel like we got a lot accomplished.
Go get your flu shot.
Yes,
That's
we did that yesterday,
one
which
thing we
is
did.
good. Tonight we thought we'd talk about music again and some things that happened this week. So you can go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. I never realized this before. I just discovered this past week that John Lennon, Johnny Ramone, obviously from the Ramones, and John Prine have birthdays all in a row. Johnny Ramone was born on October 8th, 1948. John Lennon on October 9th, 1940. And John Prine, hold on a minute, October 10, 1946. So they're all born in the 40s. They've all sadly passed away. But I never realized that their birthdays were all in a row. And I just discovered that this week through the magic of the internet. But
Yes.
what's interesting to me personally is, I mean, it's unfortunately they've all passed away. That's sad. But what's interesting to me is they all three kind of represent like different phases and being a music fan. Like I was a fan of the 60s and all that kind of stuff, the Beatles and all. Then there was the kind of 70s folk revival, and then there was punk rock, which kind of changed everything. So I just thought it was sort of an interesting thing that those three people had birthdays all in a row. And I'm old enough to remember. I like to say that I'm old enough to remember hearing about the Beatles breaking up on the radio when it happened in the spring of 1970. I was 8 years old, but I remembered it.
And I didn't realize he's the same age as my mom. 80. He would have been 80.
He would have been 80 today. And what's also peculiar about, or sad, I guess, about John Lennon's history is that he was just past his 40th birthday when he was murdered. He was murdered on December 8th, 1980. So he was really just, 2 months past his 40th birthday. And now it's 40 years later. We're going to be, acknowledging, I was going to say celebrating, obviously not celebrating,
No.
but honoring, I guess, the 40th anniversary of John
That's so
Lennon's
crazy.
murder. And, I mean, again, it's another very vivid memory. I was a freshman in college, and I remember, people gathering out on the quad for a moment of silence after John Lennon died. But it's interesting too that so aside from the fact that they're all named John, they all had like such a huge influence. I mean, in very different ways. I mean, of the three, John Prine in some ways was maybe the least known, although maybe a more famous personality.
He's from our local
Today.
area.
Well, that's the interesting thing too. Is I think today, I mean, John Prine is probably best known for writing the song "Angel from Montgomery" that Bonnie Raitt had a big hit with. And he's probably also well known for being a songwriter in Nashville for the last, I don't know. I think he
Oh,
moved
gosh.
there in the 80s,
Yeah, a
80s
long
or
time.
90s. But he actually is from a suburb right near us and was, very, very closely associated with the Chicago folk revival in the 70s. And in fact, was a student at Old Town School of Folk Music where
We took
we
lessons.
took lessons. And the story that our guitar teacher told us was that he wrote the song Paradise while he was still a student at Old Town.
Yes.
He was very young.
Like only like 19 or something like that, wasn't
Right,
he?
he was extremely young, and it's three chords, but it's like one of the most beautiful songs ever written. I remember my high school friends when I was in choir in high school. My high school friends would sit around and sing that song because I could harmonize. I never joined in, but they did.
See, and if you had played guitar back then, you could have played guitar.
Right, I could have accompanied them on the guitar because it's an easy song
That's
to
the
play.
fun part about learning guitar is there's a ton of songs. If you only know a few chords,
Yeah.
you can play a ton of songs. So that's kind of exciting.
And speaking of guitar playing and only knowing a few chords, uh, Johnny Ramone Oh wait, I gotta go back. I gotta go back to John Prine for a minute
Oh yeah.
because there's this amazing story that I just read this week. So John Prine, when he was a fixture in the Chicago folk music scene, was very close friends with Steve Goodman, another fixture in the Chicago folk music scene who sadly died very young. He had leukemia, I
Oh,
believe. And Steve Goodman is probably most famous for writing the song "City of New Orleans" that Arlo Guthrie, Woody Guthrie's son, Arlo Guthrie had a big hit with that. But in any event, John Prine described that song as the best damn train song ever wrote. But there's a story about John Prine was playing at a local club in Chicago, like a coffee shop type folk place, and Chris Christopherson was in Chicago doing some shows, and Steve Goodman knew Chris Christopherson and kept trying to get him to come and see
John
John Prine
Prine.
play. And finally, one night after John Prine had finished his set, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. Steve Goodman finally persuaded Chris Christopherson to come in. So he comes into the place, this small club, and he says, "Okay, well, so play some songs for me." So John Prine sits up on the stage by himself playing a handful of songs. And Chris Christopherson basically says, "Okay, let me get up on stage and play those same songs with you." And so they played like all night. And then eventually that turned into John Prine's first album, his first record deal.
That's so exciting.
Yeah.
I love Chris Christopherson.
Yeah,
Actually.
he's pretty cool too. But so as I was saying, speaking of not knowing very many guitar chords, what Johnny Ramone is most famous for is creating that sort of that signature guitar sound of the Ramones, where he played essentially all bar chords, and it's all downstroke. It's just hammering on the guitar down. He did. Critics would say he didn't know how to play guitar, and that's why he played that way. But the reality is, he created this incredible sound out of a very simple approach to playing guitar, and it like revolutionized rock and roll, because no one was doing what the Ramones were doing in the mid 70s. Their first album came out in 1976. That's before the Clash, before the Sex Pistols, before bands like Television had record deals and all that. So they really kind of invented punk rock, and it was all this very, very simple approach, but was such an infectious sound that they changed the rock music.
And did you see the Ramones?
I saw the Ramones in October 1981 at the University of Illinois at the auditorium building on campus. And yeah, that was amazing. That was the Pleasant Dreams tour.
And I saw them in my early 20s at Tinley Park, but it was part of like a day of like performers, and I didn't appreciate I didn't really know the Ramones that much, so
Yeah.
afterwards I was just like, it was so great, but I didn't know them going in.
And I was sort of familiar with the Ramones in the late 70s. They were a known quantity. We knew they were this punk band from New York. People didn't really understand what punk was. They thought it was kind of nihilistic and antisocial. And in reality, at least when it came to the Ramones, all they were doing really was, they were talking about being outsiders. They were just sort of like creating this space for people who didn't fit in. And that was what was so great about them.
Right.
And that was what was so great about punk rock. There wouldn't have been a Clash without, it's my personal favorite band. There never would have been a Clash without the Ramones, because there never would have been people with record contracts, saying it's okay to just be strange and different and have a
Right.
different,
You can still like tour
viewpoint.
and people come see you.
And really, you could say that's what rock music has always been. And the Beatles, in a sense, were like that too, because they completely rewrote the rule book in the 60s and created an entirely different sound that nobody had ever heard of before. And, John Prine was a little bit different because he was his approach was very traditional. He wrote folk music, but his lyrics were completely off the wall. And so it wasn't like, Dylan or Pete Seeger or Woody Guthrie or any of the traditional folk people. He was writing stuff. And he wrote some, some really amazing social commentary, like, Sam Stone was an incredible song. Your flag decal won't get you into heaven anymore. Just, he was talking about things that other people weren't necessarily talking about, and was doing it in a really, really sort of unique and clever and witty sort of way.
I think if John Lennon were still alive, I think he would still be performing and just be have continued on writing songs and stuff like that.
Well, and it's one of those things too where he's kind of like, I don't know, you think of Stevie Ray Vaughan or some of these other people. He went through a very difficult period of time. In fact, Joe Strummer had a similar thing where he went through very, very difficult period of time, bad relationships, maybe some alcohol and drug problems along the way, whatever, and then kind of got his act together. And in John Lennon's case, he came out with the album Double Fantasy in the, I guess in the fall of 1980. So
Yeah.
it wasn't very long before he died. And, and then to have, you finally get back on your feet, and to have that taken away from you. Joe Strummer went through a really rough time in the 90s, and then towards the end of the decade got back on his feet, and then died.
Things were going great.
Yeah, he had big albums and was really successful overseas, and then had a undiagnosed heart condition, and he died of a heart attack.
Walking his dog.
Walking his dog.
Yeah.
On a December morning in England. Yeah, so the story of John Lennon passing away is really sad. Johnny Ramone died of cancer. John Prine, unfortunately, came down with COVID, and
Back in April.
Back in April, he died. So, in any event, it's just an interesting thing for me. It's kind of like that musical evolution of the Beatles to the folk thing of the '70s to punk rock. That kind of describes everything I was into through a good part of my life. But it's sad they all passed away, but they left an incredible legacy.
Definitely. And let us know what your favorite artists are in the comments, or musicians that touched your lives at certain periods of your life. Mine's Celine Dion. No, I'm just kidding.
I forgot to mention one thing about Johnny Ramone that's interesting.
Okay, what's that?
Is that unlike Joey, who's the most recognizable member of the Ramones because he's like 8 feet tall, Johnny Ramone was actually super conservative, which is really funny because you sort of, identify punk as kind of a, whatever. I don't know, not necessarily left leaning, but yeah, He was super conservative. And nobody knew that. He showed up when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2002, which unfortunately not too long before he died, showed up with a T-shirt that said, "God bless George W. Bush." Which I guess Joey was not really too thrilled about, but I think it's pretty funny. Politics aside, I just think it's funny that they had very, very, very different views, but they still created this like incredible sound.
That is funny. I didn't know that about
I didn't know that until recently. So, yeah.
So you can still coexist in the same family.
Yeah, although apparently they hated each other. But he still created that incredible guitar sound, which I love, but can't.
So we'll try to
play.
We can learn play a John Prine song at some point.
We did. We played Paradise in our class.
That's true. Yeah. So we'll practice that and do another recital.
Yeah, that's right.
So we were gonna post some pictures. Oh, maybe tell them about the picture of the John Lennon guitar.
Oh yeah, we'll put it at the beginning. It's John Lennon's guitar from 1962. Is encased in glass.
I know we touched the glass. We didn't touch the
Old Town School of Folk Music. When you walk in the entrance of one of their buildings, it's right there, right next to Pete Seeger's banjo.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of cool.
So we have that picture. So I'll share that
picture. Yeah.
But we hope you guys have a good rest of the weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.